Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another transition dialogue hosted by Spectre Rico. We are joined in again today with another pre COP29 webinar. And today, the topic of discussion is nature based solutions. How are we harnessing the ecosystems for climate resilience? My name is Nooralain, and I'm joining you representing two organizations. And then we're joined in by Sajida Aslam, the founder and partner of Spectre Rico, and Patty Kennedy from the North American Land Trust. Hi, you both. How are you?
Hi, great, thank you.
Wonderful. Sounds working perfectly. Those of you who are joining us on LinkedIn, remember the entire purpose of holding the transition dialogues webinars is to have all of you join in the conversation, join Spectrico and other organizations that are working on ESG reporting and ESG related initiatives. So please do join in into the conversation. We are live on our LinkedIn. If you have any questions, comments, queries, that are focused on the topic for today. So please feel free to ask us a question. What are we going to discuss today? So there's this law flung debate when we look at the ESG domains and we look at how much investment is going in and where is it going. We talk about different financial instruments. We talk about the whole ticket size of how big the investments are being made into the ESG domain. And yet, there is one aspect in which we look at the nature side and we look at how can we have mitigation and climate mitigation specifically done in terms of solutions that are already out there, but just for us to work smart, wrap our heads around what drives the maximum benefit out of it. So today's debate is going to be all about how are we nurturing our ecosystems and our communities, and what is it that can be a reversed approach when we look at the nature based systems, when we look at solutions that for some of us we would have read up in books and we would have read up, right in the primary schools that this is an impact that actually happens on the climate change. But when it has come right now to talk about taking concerted efforts and looking at how the earth needs our support in still surviving and making sure that there is greater action, that is where the nature-based solutions are going to have the maximum impact. So I know that Sajid has a presentation on the topic. So if we could put him up, and whilst he's doing that, again, just a reminder that we do have these sessions so that we can have a two-way conversation. So please join us in, and we'll look through your comments, suggestions, and your questions and aim to answer it. Over to you, Sajid.
Thank you. Thank you, Noor, and thank you, Patty. So, I think the topic is important. It's going back to basic. Today, what we are facing as a climate challenge is because of how we have interacted with the nature. And now, this is something where we have to go back and see what we can fix and how we can fix that one. So, a little bit introduction around Spectrico. It's a global technology advisory and implementation company. Excuse me. Our key focus is always how we can bring and simplify the ESG and sustainability journey, how we can really help our clients and different governments to expedite the overall journey and make sure it's stay simple, it stay focused, and we do what really matters. Right. So from there, let's pick up the topic for today. What are nature-based solutions? I think in 2022, United Nations has defined it in a very first time, properly articulated it, the actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal and marine ecosystem which address social, that's an important element, economics, again an important element, and environmental challenges affecting effectively and adaptively while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience and biodiversity benefit. So if you look at this definition, so it's talking about the social, economic, and environmental challenges. So nature-based solutions are the one which provide a roadmap to really help the human beings to earn their living and live in an ecosystem which is more aligned the way the nature has designed it earlier, and at the same time make it resilient so the climate change or the effect of climate change can be addressed by that. So we will come back to nature-based solution when we see some of the examples there. So I picked up a couple of examples how the nature-based solutions are managed or implemented in a different area. So ecosystem restoration itself is a one nature-based solution. Whether we talk about reviving the rivers, we talk about the restoration of the wetland, or we're talking about the reforestations, whether we are talking Amazon or we are talking in a different part of the world. Sustainable land management, and the biggest use of the land is agriculture or agroforestry practices there, conservation practices within the agriculture, sustainable agriculture. So I think there are a lot of things which come with the use of the land and how we really nurturing that land and preserving the biodiversity at the same time. The third area I think is important is the coastal protections. Like we have seen a lot of floods in a different part of the world, and those really created that kind of damages which are very difficult to recoup or even for the governments to really reinvest in those areas and recreate that living and livelihood situations again. So coastal protection through the mangroves, through the coral reef restoration, through the salt marsh restorations in the San Francisco Bay, USA. That's one of my examples there. Again, come to the fourth one is the urban green infrastructure. And again, this infrastructure coming out, doing the small thing like the green roof on the buildings. And we have seen a one in Toronto, Canada. We are talking about the tree plantation in the urban areas, community gardens as a one of a project. And then other area important for the NbS or the nature-based solution is the water management. How we construct the wetlands for the wastewater treatment, how we really preserve or harvest the rainwater, how we really do the conservation of the water with the sustainable use. So water management practices in a different part of the world as well as at our own home. It's an important element and that's also part of a nature-based solution. Biodiversity conservation. Biodiversity, and we will see further in the presentation, 50% of the global GDP is dependent on the nature. How we really get our raw materials or finished goods, or how we really use the land to really create the final or finished products through the industrial processes. Biodiversity is the one of an area which can help us to get the better yield. It also helps us to have those species available which are required to generate fertility within the agriculture system, like the microbes and wildlife, which also help us to really pollination of the seeds. If we talk about, so how we really going to do and what we need to do from a biodiversity conservation perspective, while 50% of our global GDP is dependent on the overall nature related resources. And then definitely one thing where we have to create the solution on the natural disaster and the risk reduction, whether we are talking about floodplains, we are talking about the systems or building the natural barrier like the dunes and the wetland to protect against the storm surge. So these are the natural disaster risk reduction strategies which can be defined, not the engineering solutions, but more the nature-based solutions. Again, like I mentioned, 50% of the world GDP is dependent on the efficient and sustainable use of natural assets. So I think that's good enough for us to understand our dependency on the nature, and nature is not dependent on us. So we are dependent on the nature and we need to really preserve that or at least restore that if we have already moved in a certain direction, like in our industrialization phase, how we can get back to the restoration activity and make sure agriculture, fishery, forestry, tourism, these are the key sectors which are driving a certain economic benefit by using the nature. So how we are going to treat that and how we are going to restore that. Again, another example, and there's a studies which shows with the right kind of effective implementation of a nature, and that's a key word, nature-based solution and effective implementation. We have seen the implementation in past, which was not effective, and this did not consider the biodiversity and the local environment and did not end up well. So nature-based solution need to be very well planned. Effective implementation can help us to really remove 10 plus gigaton carbon dioxide equivalent, or GHG if we use as a term, greenhouse gases, from the environment every year, right? So it's a good substitute. It's something which need to complement with our reduction activities which we are doing. It doesn't mean that the nature-based solution can replace the activity which we need to do for the reduction of the emissions, like from a fossil fuel perspective or other practices. So emission reduction activity has to be done, but at the same time, simultaneously, we have to move towards the nature-based solution, and the 10 gigaton represent almost one third of the global emission which we do every year. So that means there is a significant capacity for sequestration if we move towards the nature-based solution and effectively implement. But again, I can't stress this more. It does not mean that we should not be doing the reduction in emission activity. That's a primary responsibility, and the nature-based solution will complement that. And then the comprehensive strategy that includes the rapid cut in the GHG across all the sectors are essential. So again, nature-based solution is not the only solution. It's a part of that comprehensive strategy. That's been reduction of the emission is a one side of the equation, and increasing the sequestration capacity is other side of the equation. And then globally, because there were a lot of discussion, what does it mean? What does the nature-based solution include? What qualifies for the nature-based solution as well? So IUCN has defined a global standard, and there is a 8 criteria and 28 indicators to identify whether a solution qualifies as a nature-based solution or not. And why it's important for qualification, we will come later. It has a reporting implication, it has got an investment implication, it has got a labeling implications as well. So based on these 8 criteria, which include the societal challenges, scaling, biodiversity, net gain, economic viability, I think that's another important myth normally people have, that if we are doing a nature-based solution, so it's not necessarily economically viable. It's good for environment, but it might not make money. But as per the standard, nature-based solution should be economically viable. Secondly, it should have an inclusive governance. So that means the community engagement is an important part in a nature-based solution, because if you look at the communities, they are highly dependent on their nature around them for their living and the livelihood there. So their engagement to protect that or restore that, and their consent and involvement in that project is an important element. Balance trade-offs. So we have to really assess that where we can do the trade-off in terms of the synergies, and where we have to move towards the industrialized solution. Again, it's a viability one. And adaptive management with the climate change, how we are going to evaluate that, how we will make sure that solution stay there for life or a longer term. And then the mainstreaming and sustainability, that it has to be a part of the overall comprehensive strategy. It cannot be done in isolation. Again, the question comes back to economic viability of nature-based solutions. So if we are talking about the agroforestry, if we are talking about the restoration of the forest, how it will be viable. So I think there are very good examples from Amazon, and there's a huge investment went in there. It's almost 1.6 billion-dollar worth investment went in the restoration of Amazon as a forest, and the viability is coming from a non-term timber uh, forest products. So they have created a revenue stream to pay off that debt which is created around that project, and at the same time making sure the community is not relying on timber for their economic needs. They have got an alternate economic stream, and from that economic stream there is a repayment schedule, and the structure is built for the payment of that loan as well. So these are the kind of things which we are seeing there as a part of economic viability. Similarly, we talk about the planting of trees, and then there's a second challenge comes into play: who is going to take care of that tree and make sure that it live its full life? uh, it's in the first 5 years there is always a challenge whether that tree will survive or not. One in a three survive, right? And then if that local community is heavily dependent on the sale of the timber, that's the primary economic activity they are looking at. So that there is a risk that as soon as the tree is grown enough to provide that kind of wood, that tree will be cut and that will be sold in the market. And the alternative is that you create the forest, you plant the trees, and you create a mechanism to harvest the high value herbs, flowers, and there's a complete agroforestry economic system or ecosystem which can help you to or help the local community to have a more higher value commodity and the products there, and they can take care of that area, and they normally become a part of that overall project to take care of that and make sure the economic benefit is flowing to that community. And you can protect the forest and the tree because that's the ecosystem which is required to grow that kind of herbs or flower there. There are very interesting recent financial instruments which were being used for different nature-based solutions. So there's a one instrument which is a restoration of seed capital facility, and the biggest success factor which was identified is the concessional capital and technical assistance. The barrier was the concessional funding and the ecosystem building by supporting the new fund at a different stage of development with the aligned capital requirements. So there's a lot of compliances which went in. Similarly, I'll go back to the Living Amazon mechanism. So local engagement identify the direct beneficiary. So from a nature-based solution, again, the question always comes, who is the beneficiary for that one? And definitely community is the one, but if there are other players or a stakeholder involved, how they will be benefit from that overall structure. And again, engaging the off-takers as an early investor, and with the technical support, they managed to create a complete financial instrument which is deployed there. And I have an example there for that one. So this is how they have really designed the instrument. As a case study, I put the Living Amazon Mechanism Instrument Mechanic, and there's a complete structure which includes the philanthropic capital, which includes the concessional capital, which includes the commercial capital, and it's also include the part of a grant. And the commercial and concessional capital is deployed and it's being repaid. So it's not the grant money, it's not the free money which is going in. There is a proper local cooperatives and association who's taking care of it, and they are generating revenue with the non-timber forest product, and part of it is going back for the funding the or serving the debt and repayment of the principal at the same time. Just the key stakeholder, just a highlight there, and then we will be going back to the question. So the government itself is a key stakeholder once it's come to the nature-based solution, because most of the time it's required permission, concessions, licenses, some type of framework to use a large piece of land, the capital holder and allocator, the investment pipeline itself, the people who are bringing the projects, what kind of projects they are bringing and how they are really putting together the mechanics around it, and the local community, how the borrower, because they are ultimately they are the beneficiary and the borrower one way or other. So how those borrowers are going to get involved in that project with all the technical assistance which will be available through that mechanism, like we see in case of the Amazon. Uh, then another interesting thing, the nature-based or nature-related financial disclosure, there's a standards and the guideline which was available earlier as well that still exists out there, but now it's more evolved in terms of the ESRS in Europe, GRI again it's a voluntary adoption, IFRS again it's a matter of adoption, and even within the US SEC climate disclosure, there is a certain limited coverage around the climate risk related with the nature related risk or coverage is there. So if you see the highlighted one, ESRS explicitly required that reporting, GRI comprehensively required that reporting. IFRS has got a financial materiality on the nature, limited coverage in SEC, but TNFD, which is a part here, it has provided a very comprehensive guideline, just like the TCFD in the past, around the governance, risk management, and the key targets. And these are the ones which are adopted significantly in Europe and limited way in IFRS as we speak. And then SEC has also implemented it in a limited capacity. So that's all from my side, and we can build more upon the conversation and see that how we explore this area further. Noor, back to you. Uh, Fatma, you there? So while the team is going to join back, I think we can start with the question. We have got one question. It's around the how we can effectively measure the success of a nature-based solution and what are the some best practices. I think if we go back to the fundamental which I was sharing earlier, there is a very defined criteria for that. So there are 8 criteria and 28 different indicators to really understand whether a solution qualify for a nature-based solution as per the IUCN definition. And the second part is the reporting the impact. So all those areas, whether it's a biodiversity or it's a economic viability, in both cases there are certain criteria which are very well defined. And in the TNFD, there is a certain target setting and the disclosure requirement as well, which are adopted by the different standards and the regulation as we speak today. Uh, in US, there is a concept which is called right now more. So we are there.
So
So
you can carry on the thought, yeah.
yeah. So in the US, there is a concept that, and I think Patty will highlight that further. So there's a concept if you are doing a certain development, whether it's in the infrastructure or a residential one, and there is a certain ecosystem which, particularly for the wetland, if you are interfering with that, and there is no way you can avoid it, so you have to really invest and pay a certain amount to a mitigation bank which undertake that responsibility and restore a certain other area from the wetland or a stream to make sure the impact is balanced out. And there is a proper tracking for that which is available as well. So I'll leave that for Patty to explain and expand on that conversation later. So back to you, Noor.
Thank you so much, Sujit. And we had a little bit of a hiccup, but we're back up. So just summarizing and extracting your conversation and just trying to like put things into perspective. Patty, the entire conversations around NBS, nature-based solutions, is community versus the corporate, right? And we see that a lot of the ESG discussions are based around the fact that the corporates need to do this, the organizations that are emitting the carbon footprints, etc., etc. When we look at some examples specifically in the US context, I know where you're based at, what is the role and what you have seen the contribution towards the NBS where the community is involved?
Well, there are a number of ways that communities, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits can play a really important role in this. And there's some real innovation on marrying the carbon development or NbS solutions that are being implemented by using some of these players and pulling them into the corporate world to meet their restrictions, or offset their footprints. One of the things I'm very excited about. So we talked a little bit earlier. I work for a land trust, which is a land conservation organization, and what we do every single day is nature-based solutions. We protect land, we restore land, we document, biodiversity, we do pollinator habitat. The issue is partnering it with both a financial model, a regulatory model, or even an ESG framework. And that's where I think these NbS financial disclosures, some of the regulatory frameworks that are coming around ESG, are marrying these community groups that are working every day on mission-driven work with a policy or a position or a mechanism to actually have impact, both financially, but also to bring a level of professionalism to the work that's happening on the ground. I mentioned very quickly an example of a wonderful woman who I met who's working in Brazil on a carbon development project. And what she has done is take a portion of the revenue and reinvest it into rural women businesses and try and lift the entire community in which she's working, while at the same time making a return on the investment for investors. And that kind of model is what I think is very transformative, both on the local and on national scale. I also will say, I think some of the regulatory frameworks are acknowledging this, with their requirements for secondary benefits, for to avoid some of the greenwashing. They're wanting to see how local communities or the outcomes of the work have true impact. And that's, I think, a really important pivot, so that you avoid some of the either greenwashing or some of this work that's purely monetary that doesn't have an ethic behind it.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think like you're rightly saying is that, the community involvement is actually the thing that's driving that particular ROI. And I'm just gonna build up on what Patty is saying, Sajid, and just come on, let's address the elephant in the room. Okay, so with the NbS, there's always this discussion around, okay, are we carbon offsetting, right? Are we doing the right thing in terms of where we see that organizations would come across, and like Patty is saying, that it's a greenwashing exercise. In some cases you would have seen that it's a green wishing exercise where your sustainability targets are so high, and you're saying that you're going to do all of these. Let's assume for just for argument's sake that there's going to be lots and lots of forestation that we're going to do somewhere in the billions. Is that something that organizations are looking at, and how do we counteract the green wishing and the washing aspects of this entire scenario?
I think let's look at the philosophy of the offset. So normally that's what creates the challenge when people start looking at it in a very different way. The key responsibility is to reduce emission, full stop. So if I'm an industry, I'm a corporate, my primary responsibility is to reduce emission. And if I reduce it to the best of my effort and the level, and there's still certain emission which are I can't remove from my process, or it's not viable to remove that, then the second option is the offset. But without going through that reduction effort, if I go for the offset, in a lot of jurisdictions they have banned that. So you can't say that I'll keep emitting it, I'll buy some carbon credit and offset that. So that's the first thing. So we have to be very clear, the reduction is the primary responsibility. Second part comes to the balance of the equation. So what happened? Why we are facing this scenario today? if the earth has got a capacity to way more capacity what we are emitting even today, to absorb that in terms of the carbon sinks and all that. So earth has got that capacity. It's the velocity which is different. So the way we are emitting and the quantity we are emitting in a short time, the process which the nature has designed, that take longer time to absorb that. So that's creating an imbalance. So how we can help to get back to the balance? The nature-based solutions are the sequestrations or a sinks which we can create back or make sure we restore that. So some of the part from the balance on the right side of it, from a sequestration side, we increase the capacity. So we increase that velocity so we can start absorbing more. But the primary responsibility still remain the same. Reduce the reduction and then increase the capacity. So we try to balance that equation somehow. Even if we implement all the possible nature-based solution by 2050, still we can only cover the 20% of the expected emission we can absorb or sequestrate using that solution. So that's mean not doing the reduction will keep us or expose us to a certain risk going forward. So both activities are important. So that's where the greenwashing comes into play. But now there are a lot of regulation. Like I remember in UK some time ago, people were like in the Philippines, they were advertising, pay me $10 and I'll plant a tree, and this is your carbon credit, and you can go and make a market yourself that you have reduced or offset that one. That can't happen anymore. There are a lot of regulation, restrictions, definitions, and taxonomies now available to really qualify and quantify anything as an offset, and there's a proper verification and validation processes. So I think this greenwashing thing will start getting it will fade out soon with all the assurance which is coming into play. So I think people will be taking a great reputational risk if they try to go on a journey of greenwashing going forward.
And even with the wishing, Sajid, that is because, like we were discussing yesterday as well, that where it comes to the consumer now being more and more conscious around his or her decision making choices. I'll just like to, like, you were talking about tourism, and see what is happening across the globe on tourism. And I want to bring in your perspective here as well, Patty. But I'm going to link it up with just biodiversity in general. There has been this culture of, and I know from coming from a South Asian country, I know for a fact that monoculture forestation has always been the trend, right? That also collaborates with what we are trying to say, that in terms of greenwashing, eucalyptus trees. For example, we've read case studies after case studies that they're the easiest growing. Are we looking at the impact that is happening on the water intake? It's a water intensive plant. So the culture of, let's say, going for a nature based solution versus looking at, let's say, creating a biodiverse forest, there's more R&D, there is more investment, there is more, like Sajid is saying, that there is more sequestration that needs to take place. So in your opinion, Patty, what is it that's the right approach for this? Is it a tick box activity, or maybe the NbS that we would think should come naturally to us, that's going to take more effort?
I definitely think it's going to take more effort, but I love your term greenwashing. Again, I work for a land conservation group, but where I see, a wonderful green wish for myself, it goes back to not just reducing carbon emissions, which Sajid is exactly right, but also land protection. So, the Biden administration came out and said 50% of land protected. So, to your point, um, about the tourism, about the use of some of these forests for not just for nature-based solutions in terms of restoration, but as a nature-based amenity. National parks, national forests, biodiverse landscapes. If for every acre that was developed, there was an equal acre that was protected, overwhelmingly, you'd start to see that balance manufactured. When we talk to corporate clients as a land trust, and we say, the best way to mitigate your carbon offset and mitigate your carbon footprint would be to buy a piece of land and protect it. to invest in it from a restoration, and also to use it from a social perspective to educate your employees, to engage school groups or communities. And so I think that part of my green wish, and where I truly believe this question, it's a nature-based solution in one perspective because that's a financial model, the carbon. But I do believe part of the equation has to be landscape scale conservation and how we engage investors, governments, corporations in protecting land from development to offset the developed areas is a very important tool. One example, we're working with a developer who's buying a 6,000 acre piece of land. They're going to develop 1,000 acres, and then they're going to do a carbon development, restoration, mangrove restoration, but that will also be an amenity for nature-based experiences. So this looking at land as, not just a monetary asset, so to speak, but how it can have a larger impact is a really important part of the discussion.
That sounds like music to my ears. I'm saying that what you're talking about, and these are real life examples, Patty. And just clubbing this to my next question, Sajid, which is essentially to both of you, but Sajid, you'll go first on this. Is it really about conservation or is it about restoration? Why as a world we are mostly linked up to okay, there's a natural disaster, oh, this came because something that we didn't do right, let's say 3-4 decades ago. So what is the strategy specifically for the nature based solution where uh, do we focus on the conservation side of things, do we focus on the restoration side of things, or do we take both together?
I think it's the approach has to be both. Like what we have, what is available that need to be conserved, and then what is we have degraded in a one way or other, we need to restore that. So I think we have to go back to understand the basic fundamental, again, the principle. The species, any species, including the human being, they live in a certain ecological structures, right? So those ecological structures need to be preserved for that species to excel, strive, thrive. If we start removing that, so that's mean a lot of the natural system will be disturbed there. Now, there is a certain level of understanding human being can have around the nature, and now this is something which is becoming more paramount in the R&D, that what are those ecological systems which are required for a species like human being to survive, and what we have degraded. So anything which is degraded or we lost, how we can remove that. Anything which exists right now, we have to make sure we protect it today, so that should not get into the second level. But again, the most of our action are driven through the, I wouldn't be using the word greed, but the earning and the money and the capital side of it. So we tend to ignore that side because that's not the immediate threat to us, but it's going to be an immediate threat for the next generation who is going to inherit this kind of planet from us. So if we go with the basic principle, today what we are facing, so since the industrialization phase, we unfortunately our governance was weak, our understanding was maybe not right, the regulations were not there, so the nature was practically misused in terms of their interaction, and that is something, a burden which we are carrying today. And then it's not only that we are carrying that burden, our economic activity which was highly dependent on that, that's also suffering now. So if 50% of our global GDP, we are talking about 100 trillion, so we are talking 50, 60 trillion, is dependent on those natural assets, agriculture or forest or fisheries. So I think the impact is going to be very, very huge if we don't start take action now. Whether it's a conservation or whether it's restoration, both have to go hands in hand.
Absolutely. And Patty, I'm sure that you're nodding, so you agree to the approach. And that's something that you're also seeing in the US market as well.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think restoration, Sajid absolutely said it. I think conservation would be ideal, and that's one piece of it. I think restoration is another, but restoration is also very expensive. I think, and also, I would also say sustainable operations is expensive. It's why cattle farming is such a big it's a big issue because it at scale it can be very destructive, and in order to do it sustainably you're going to give up some of your income. And so understanding the balance between economic viability of even some of the business practices and the impact on the planet is a big part of, I think, what comes down to this discussion about can you monetize it or provide incentives for it. I think there's a role for regulation, and I also think there is a role for incentive, which is why I love a lot of the work that's coming with the carbon credits, with these carbon markets, with the acknowledgement of nature based financing for ecosystem services, is that there is a role for incentivizing people to participate or to do things in a smart way, in addition to just kind of wishing that we had this wonderful outcome. Really understanding the matrix in which all of these discussions are being had and the impacts it has day in, day out to people's livelihoods is really important.
And Sajid, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to add to what Patty is saying, but on my limited knowledge, because I see the comments also coming in, and Amar, the previous question was specifically for you. That is it a burden, or are we just looking at the suffering economies? The economies are suffering. Essentially, they are here
Yeah,
because something wasn't right in the past, and
yes,
that's where I'm bringing it to Sajid. Just reflect on the fact that every time that we speak about restoration, like Patty was also talking about, land restoration projects, and somebody takes it up and you pick it up and you try to restore it. There has to be incentivization in terms of, let's say, tax regimes, or let's say that any kind of other regimes in terms of where they could attract, let's say, more funding. So just reflect a little bit light on it, because I think when we talk about taking baby steps towards ESG, it always looks like you're climbing a mountain. So we need to make it just easier for just even community members to become a part of it. So if you could reflect on that, that I think would clarify a lot when we are talking about economies that are suffering.
so I think when we say it's expensive, and Patty picked up that it's whether we run a sustainable livestock or we run a sustainable agriculture, it's expensive, and that's true to a certain extent. But I think the way the practices are being evolved and the R&D which is happening, it's becoming viable now. So we will come to that particularly viability later, because that's always a big question when we see the nature-based solution in isolation. So funding, let's go back to the basic one. When the economies are suffering, who should invest in that? And I think that was a very big political debate, and that's still happening in a certain areas. Countries are blaming each other, that the country who was producing is responsible for that, or the country who was consuming is responsible for that. And Europe has introduced a very interesting mechanism there, which is called CBAM. It's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So if you are importing anything in Europe, so either as an exporter you settle the carbon, or as an importer you settle the carbon, but the product will not cross the border unless until there is an offset. So rather than keep going in a blame game that who should fund it, at least in a commercial transaction, they have taken a step and created a mechanism, and we are seeing other countries coming up with the same or similar standards. Second part comes to the funding side. The other question is that now they are global funds, so they are vertical climate and environment funds, which called the VCEF right now, which include the Global Climate Fund, Global Environment Fund, Adaptation Fund, and Global investment funds, and there are 4 or 5 funds there. So those funds get funding from the different countries, as well as certain organizations are also doing that. and they then redistribute based on the value. So there could be certain transparency challenge, there could be a certain challenge in terms of the capacity, how we should approach that and get that funding. But that funding is now available. So the first question, whether the funding is available or not, so people have funded those funds, and that funding is available. Is it good enough? No. It's supposed to be 100 billion a year. Are we meeting that? No. But still they are sitting on the money, and even the money which is available, people are unable to draw that because they are not investable projects. This is funding, it's not grant. So it has to be a bankable project, right? So now we come to the nature-based solution, and the example which we have seen from the Amazon side, they have created a bankable project. So there is a flow of money, there is a restoration happening, there is a income generated, and income going back and paying off that debt. If we try to talk about the grant money for restoration or the climate finance, whether the nature-based solution or technology-based solution, we are going to talk about maybe 50, 60, 70 trillion dollar worth grant. That's not going to happen. So it has to be a bankable project which can generate income and pay back. So something which we have inherited or created, we are as responsible as our previous generation was, but now the cost of inaction is too high that the cost of action is viable. So we have to move on, whether it's a restoration project or a conservation, we have to let go of that and find the other ways to make it economically viable. Economic viability is the key here. If we are trying to do the projects which are not economically viable, one way or other, it's not sustainable either.
Absolutely. And the best thing about funding is that it's always, you can park it anywhere you want as long as the project is making sense. Let's come to some questions. And I see a lot of questions coming in. I'll try to like club in some. Let's talk about barriers. Okay. That let's talk about some challenges. We've covered a few, but Yasa, you can see Yasa's question here that what are some persistent barriers to NBS adoption, and how are they being addressed through ecosystem building efforts? Patty.
Well, I think, I mean, I can speak mostly to the United States, and our
Yeah.
experience is just there. A lot of the nature-based solutions are a long-term investment, and a lot of capital doesn't want to be patient in that capacity, and that makes it very difficult. So for quick returns, it's just not it's not a vehicle for making money, even if there's economic viability behind the project. There are also a lot more. There are some industries, and I will use silviculture for one, where you have commercial timber. It's not a sustainable, it's not traditionally considered a nature-based solution. It is a natural income source, but it's not necessarily done sustainably. But those are the mainstream investment vehicles that most people know. And so some of the newer technologies, the ecosystem services, the restoration, it's harder to compete with some of these traditional models and implement them. That's primarily the barrier that I see. I also see in the United States, nature-based solutions, the question about them in terms of how they are being accepted from a regulatory perspective, from a financial perspective, it's just very new. I think you saw with the Biden administration and a lot of the U.S. government agencies, the Department of Interior, and even some of our consultancies, they're adopting these principles now and criterias around evaluating these practices, but it's still very new.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Sajid, I think I would want you to, just reflect on the carbon accounting challenges. So I know for a fact that, there's always a debate, okay, how do we calculate how much carbon dioxide is absorbed by planting this whole forest? How is it that that can be mitigated, and is it more of a R&D initiative, or is it more of a have patience and then see the impact?
I think from a calculation perspective now, they are more defined standards and the protocol and the emission factor by the different species of the plants as well. So I think the calculation and the expected life, it's again the probabilities. So that's the over the life of that particular plant or tree. So there's a carbon life assessment which is called, and there are proper standards and the reporting and the calculation methodologies which have evolved, validated, verified, and even the from a carbon accounting and the carbon credit perspective, those are the accepted methodology by the verifier and assurer at the same time. So calculation and the carbon accounting is not as big issue as it used to be. I just want to pick up a very interesting project somebody mentioned in the chat, Ruda. That's a wonderful project in Pakistan. That is called Ravi Urban Development Authority. So if you look at the name, it comes as a urban development authority, where this entire project is an environmental project. And in fact, it's not an urban development project. They have used the urban development as a vehicle, as a public private partnership one, and they have created a lot of document policies and a financial instrument to raise money to revive the river Ravi. So it's a restoration of the river Ravi for the water side, to make sure the city adjacent to Ravi, which is Lahore, where I live as well. So that's where uh, they can ensure the water supply. Otherwise, 3 to 4 years, that city will be the water will be very scarce in this city. So they have really developed an entire model in a way where they are attracting investment on the real estate side, and those have to be sustainable. That's a part of the guideline, and that's a public private partnership. International and local people are working there, but all that money is going for the restoration of the river. And interestingly, government is not funding that organization. That organization is self-funded through their own vehicles which they have created. Even even the salaries and operational expenses are being met through those vehicles rather than the government budget.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think so that answers one of the questions. I think since I was having a discussion with one of our attendees, so that's really great. Let's talk about community. All right, let's talk about national adaptability plans, because we see in the comments as well a lot of discussion, Patty, around the national adaptability plans, how the community involvement is pretty important in terms of taking this forward. And I think a lot what we see now, that you pick up agriculture, the community is important. You pick up tourism, the community is important. So how do you think that amongst the different stakeholders, the key players, specifically for NbS, where can the community involvement start off with?
In all honesty, in the United States, we don't see this a lot, but I do think it needs to happen at the state or the local level. And what you named a number of the stakeholders, but there's infrastructure, to Sajid's point, and the project he was just talking about. So there's infrastructure, there's governance, there's farming and agriculture. So when you look at any local community, the stakeholders that make up that community need to all have a seat at the table, and they need to be talking about nature, whether it's a green print where you're identifying areas that are going to be used for agriculture, nature, tourism. Every single player needs to essentially be asked that question. And then those pieces can then be added to the larger piece. So to me, it's no different than any master planning exercise where you take a geographical area and you identify all the major stakeholders in that area, but you pose to them the question about nature, about impact, and about protection or restoration or the needs based on those various stakeholders. And that plan needs to be from the ground up. That's how I would see it going, and how I believe you engage all of your stakeholders appropriately.
Absolutely, Patty. And specifically for the US market, we also see that again we keep talking about ESG, that it should not leave anybody worse off, right? So if land restoration, let's assume, is coming at the cost of indigenous communities who are living in remote areas, and you are throwing them off because we want to restore the land, and there has to be a process on that. So any activity, again, for getting to a carbon or a net zero, if you are just putting in people worst off, that goes against the whole entire process of why we started off in the first place. I truly believe. I think we do have time to pick up one more question, and I'll pick up Zaida's, because I think let's talk about some successes. So when we're talking about, it's way up. So the question is going to be the second one on our screen: that how can we effectively measure the success of the NBS, and what are some best practices for monitoring and reporting the impact? Sajid.
So I think we discussed that point earlier as well. So we have got now a defined way where there are 8 criteria to qualify which project is the nature-based solution. So that's already given by IUCN, and there are 28 indicators which identify its progress to qualify whether we are successful or not. And then all the reporting standards, and particularly ESRS and GRI specifically, they both have got a comprehensive reporting criteria around it. IFRS only touched that in terms of financial risk, and same goes with the SEC climate disclosure. So from a financial risk perspective, and then we have TNFD as an overall framework specifically for task force as a nature related financial disclosure. So it's quite a comprehensive guidelines which are available to really measure it and report it.
I will also say two things I'd like to say, because I think that's a very regulatory capacity. There are local ways to do it. So, for example, we talked about mitigation or wetland mitigation or stream mitigation, where you can actually have a measurable, it was degraded and now it has been restored. There are ways that you can measure biodiversity through tree growth, species counting, inventories. So there's this very high regulatory framework, but there are a lot of people that are working boots on the ground almost to showcase that the work is being done and document. I will also say, because I had to do it yesterday and I'll do it today, it's what I love about Spectrico. The model that was created, to me, their dashboard and platform is you can both model based on everything from this amount of acreage or this amount of degradation, and then you can follow it through and quantify and provide those updates, and that will help with the reporting tools. I guess to that point, technology is beginning to catch up with both the regulatory framework and the boots on the ground, and that nexus is also very exciting from a documentation and monitoring perspective.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing from both of you is that, particularly for NBS, our shopping list is really, really vast. There are so many areas in which we can actually go in, from wetlands to mangroves to, let's say, afforestation. So there's a lot of different aspects that can be put into implementation. And what I want to see is also that there's a trajectory, and there's a positive trajectory in which you start off with a piece of land, and then build that up as a case study to expand on the successes of it. I think I've pretty much tried to like cover up all of the questions that we have, but I don't see any more coming in. But Sajid, any final thoughts on where can people find the resources to look at the NBS, case studies, and what do you reckon, other than the IOC? And I know you have said that, but where else can somebody? Because we always talk about talent, and I'm thinking at the transition we should always also focus on where the green jobs are going to land up, specifically for the NBS. Where should people be looking at, and what kind of like resources can be accessed?
Uh, I think one resource which I refer would be the World Bank. There is a lot of research which is available there. So, and they also come up with the funding and financing arrangement. We can also look for There is a climate policy initiative, so that's a very good website, and they also got a good tool sets and the toolkits for that. So and then Spectrico as well. We keep posting some content there and the white papers around it. But just from a last point, the nature-based solution. When we say nature-based solution, they are very localized solutions. So if you are talking about a one city or a part of a city, so that solution is very much focused on that community and that situation and that climate and that area and ecological system of that area. So it's not possible something which is viable in Brazil we can do in California and something similar in UK. That's not possible. So that's why the nature-based solution has got its own criteria, and that's involved the local community. So any third party who's entering there and trying to implement something without having that deep knowledge of that community and their dependency on those natural resources, it's not going to be a viable solution. And we have seen that, where in one of a country they tried to do the agroforestry, but they were using a different species rather than the local species, and that was a miserable failure because those species cannot really expand or grow in those particular situations. So
Hmm.
for the nature-based solution, the local research and involvement is an important one. It's always a community-led and community own that one, and they get the key. They become the key beneficiary of the project as well.
Wonderful. Patty, your thoughts on this?
Well, I agree with what Sajid said. Nature-based solutions to me is a necessary conversation for every local community, national community, international community. It is the way forward if we don't get it right, whether it's restoration, whether it's or conservation, land protection, obviously, um, we're not going to be able to get out of this. I think that the climate situation that we're in, I think it's a really important conversation, and everybody should be moving in that direction.
So, as the proverb goes, you guys do what comes naturally to you. And that is where I would want to close today's session. It has been phenomenal. Thank you to all of the live participants who joined into our conversation, and those of you who would be watching this webinar recording later on. We do a series, so if you haven't yet, just look up Spectrico on LinkedIn pages, and we should have the website, but just go ahead and look up for spectorico.com, and you'd find a wealth of publications and knowledge and white papers on there, so you can refine your knowledge better. Thank you so much, Sajid. Thank you so much, Patty. Till we
Thank you.
see you on the other side of the transition dialogue, that's a bye bye from all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.